Here is the voice of the working class, Rick Smith.
And welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for being here today on the big program. Lots to get to, lots to talk about after a little over a week vacation, a little much needed rest, rejuvenate the batteries, all of that stuff. And look, dropping away from all of the world burning and in a much needed moment of just stepping back and seeing what's going on from a distance. And we are a nation in crisis. We have a crisis of leadership. And we have a whole bunch of problems that aren't being addressed by our political structure. And this is, again, we talk about elections. We talk about the need for leadership. We talk about the need for people to actually, vote. And with all of the people in the streets and all of the protests and all of the, all the online activism and all the tweets and all the Facebook posts, it's got to turn into votes. It's got to get to the point to where we throw the bums out and we put other bums in. Maybe ones that are going to actually do what needs to be done. Because I look at the disgrace we have in the White House today. And look, day one back, you go, what surprise could Donald Trump possibly have in store today for me? So I see this event where, evidently a lot of southern states are seeing huge uptick in the number of coronavirus cases. They're actually having record numbers of days. So Donald Trump comes out with the genius moment, of which, he's said a couple of times. But again, every time I hear it, it just goes, this is why this guy is completely, totally unfit for, to lead a picnic to the zoo, let alone lead the most powerful nation in the world. He said simply, if we stop testing right now, we'd have very few cases, if any. So all we have to do, stop testing. See how easy that would be? Now, we'll just call it something else, kind of like I believe those southern states have been doing from the beginning. And, before we went on break, we talked about, Florida and Texas and those southern states who were reporting record numbers of deaths due to pneumonia, not coronavirus, but pneumonia. And you go, but isn't that what basically kills you with the coronavirus? I mean, isn't that basically a lung thing? Isn't it, fills your lungs with fluid and basically you drown in your own fluid? Isn't that kind of it? And the thing is, I look now and I'll tell you, I'm a bit hopeful. A couple of weeks ago, I really was not. I was in a moment of despair, I think like a lot of the nation, where we were looking for some sign that maybe there's hope. And I look at the fact that right now in Iowa, where Donald Trump won in 2016 by 9 points, he's only leading Joe Biden by one point at this moment. Now, understand, as we progress and the political season heats up, that might change. But at this moment, it looks like Iowa could be in play. You look at the fact that in Arkansas, Joe Biden is only down by 2 points in a state that Donald Trump won by 27 points. There is some bit of hope, which is why you see the desperation coming out of the Trump campaign and the need to get out into the field and stop governing. And there's part of me that goes, I'm okay with him stopping doing what he's doing because it's destructive. But he's going to take the Trump Roadshow back on the road. He's going to Tulsa, Oklahoma, originally for Juneteenth, originally scheduled for June 19th. Big problem there for a lot of people. So they did blink. They did move it to June 20th. And, I kept seeing all these emails coming from people. Oh, we're going to have 200,000 people demanding tickets. There are 300,000 people who want tickets to this event. No, I got one email that said 800,000 people wanted tickets to the 19,000 seat arena the BOK Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So they got 800,000 people are demanding tickets for the 19,000-seat arena. And it made me think of, the old political frame of you get a small room and you pack it full of people and have people standing outside so it looks like, someone cares. And do I believe there are 800,000 people who are demanding tickets? No, not really. Considering Tulsa, Oklahoma is only home to about, I think the latest number I saw was 430,000 people in Tulsa itself. The greater metropolitan area is just a little shy of 1 million. So look, as red as Oklahoma may be, I don't know that 80% of the people are going to show up. Just kind of throwing that out there. But this is, one of those moments where Trump needs to change the narrative because the narrative for him is all bad. The fact of the matter is, Corona's not gone away. They've still done a horrible job on it. And now with the reopening, they're going to do everything they can do to quash the numbers. They're going to do everything they can do to hold down the number of people that are now reporting becoming sick. And this is the dangerous part. And this is what we talked about before we took our break. The part that was going to be really frightful to me is if states were going to do this, limit the number of tests, limit the number of reportings on the testing, and just say, you know what, everything's fine. You go right about your daily business. Don't worry about it. And look, where I live, you see some people with masks. I mean, you go into a store, I think most people, they put it on before they walk in the door and they take it off the second they get out of the door. They're trying on some level, but for the most part, I see us moving away from it. And the troublesome part in all of this is we're only a couple of weeks into the quote unquote reopening. In fact, where I'm at in Pennsylvania, it's only a couple of days. And, what does, 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, what does that bring us? And, as my wife and I have said a number of times, the concern is that we have this explosion in the fall. And if you think it was bad, March, April into May, what happens with another explosion? What happens with another boom? Because we're about 2.1 million cases already in just a couple of months. North of 115,000 dead. And I would argue that number is way low. But what do we do? Because the political class is going to be in election season. Where do we go? What happens? And it becomes one of these moments where, we've got a lot to talk about and a lot to get to. And you look at these protests out in the streets and look, do I blame people being out in the streets right now and demanding justice and demanding fair treatment? Absolutely not. This has been something that has been decades, centuries in the making. And the rioting and the looting and all of the stuff that you see on TV, I don't believe is representative of the people who are out there calling for justice. Again, you have these knuckleheads out there who want trouble. They want chaos. They want division. And the question that I keep coming back to, and one of the things we're going to be working through on this program for the next several weeks, is how do we, in a constructive way, have a conversation about a race in America? How do we have a constructive conversation about policing? How do we move the ball forward in a way that we don't look back on this moment and go, it was just another moment. It was another one of those, nothing happened. Maybe a little nibbles around the edge, maybe a little changes here or there, but no real change. How often does it have to happen? And on the other side of this, for policemen, I can't imagine that they want this in their ranks either. At least I hope. So we've got lots to get to, lots to talk about. Also, the big historic decision today by our Supreme Court literally shocked literally shocked by Neil Gorsuch and John Roberts siding with the liberals on the LGBTQ case. We're going to talk about that, but lots to get to and lots to talk about. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, going to look at, how do we take this moment? How do we take this moment in history and move it into a constructive conversation? How do we move it forward and take advantage of this crisis and turn crisis into opportunity? When we come back, Greg Horowitz is going to be here to share some thoughts. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's got a series of pieces over at The Bulwark that are worth discussing. So when we come back, Greg Horowitz is going to be here to share some thoughts. Quick break, right back. Stick around.
There's nothing more American than workers standing up, and the union gives a voice to win. On the Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1937. That was the day anti-union violence erupted in the Valley of Steel. The Little Steel Strike was then in its 20th day. The strike had spread to Bethlehem's Cambria Works in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Newspaper headlines screamed, 30 clubbed, stabbed, shot in strike. Guerrilla warfare breaks out anew in Pennsylvania. The day had been marred by hours of fighting with scabs and the police as miners joined picketers in support. Strikers lobbed rocks at scab cars attempting to drive through picket lines and successfully overturned a number of vehicles. Steel-helmeted police attacked strikers, swinging riot clubs and launching tear gas shells. One picketer, Tony Mandos, was in critical condition after having been shot twice by police. Mayor Daniel Shields announced he had deputized 250 special police and was preparing to, quote, raise an army of 3,000 American Legionnaires by nightfall to protect the city of Johnstown from strikers. At Warren, Ohio, dynamite crippled railroad operations at a struck Republic steel mill on the Ashtabula-Niles branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The explosion came after carloads of raw material had been shunted in and products shipped out of the mill. Auto plants throughout the Midwest slowed production for lack of steel-made parts. UAW President Homer Martin dispatched a telegram to CIO leader John L. Lewis saying, quote, we are standing by ready to refuse to use steel made in struck plants in the production of automobiles, unless the steel companies make a speedy and amicable settlement with the striking steelworkers. The CIO threatened a 20,000-strong strike support rally through the streets of Johnstown to protest the violence. They claimed victory when the governor quickly declared martial law and padlocked the gates of the Cambria Works.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So as I said, I deliberately stayed away from cable news while we were on vacation. And, look, I checked in. I'm this kind of political junkie that can't stay completely away. I did check the sources I generally check in with, the Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News Online, CNN Online, stuff like that. The reading stuff, not the video stuff. I stayed away from cable news completely because, to be honest, I didn't want to see the same broken window over and over and over again. I didn't want to see if it bleeds, it leads. I wanted to read the articles. I wanted to hear what people had to say and be able to formulate some bit of thought. Because look, as I said, I didn't buy into the rioters and the looters and all of that because I believe it's all just kind of a change of narrative that I think is unhelpful. And here to share some thoughts on this and where we are as a country. I've asked Greg Horowitz to come and talk with us. He's got a piece out called It's a Setup, which I absolutely agree with, over at The Bulwark. He's got a series of 4 of them over there that you can check out. We'll get links out to. Greg is also a New York Times best-selling thriller author, so I check out his stuff there. Greg, thanks for taking time for us.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's good to talk to you.
So let's start with the setup argument that what we're seeing on cable news, the windows we're seeing broken. It's a setup. Walk me through it.
Well, if you look at all of this, the media is going to show us a lot of images of black thugs and blacks behaving badly. And that's what we're going to get on a perennial loop, particularly from Fox News. And the thing is, if you look at this, there's a lot of professional saboteurs who have been, infiltrating the ranks of these riots. There's a lot of African-American leaders and protesters and activists saying, please don't throw the brick. Please don't spray paint the building. Please don't damage the police car, because you know who it's going to land on? It's going to land on us, because it always does. And of course, when I published this, the one bit of pushback I got, which was so predictable, is, well, I've seen the images of looting and there's people of all colors. And it's like, right, if somebody interrupted, this process of mourning, literally as a flashpoint with weaponry, with blowing things up, with instigating violence against police officers, and started a conflagration and walked away, of course there's going to be people who are in the mix who can now be advertised that are not behaving lawfully. That is not the predominant voices we're getting from the African American community. And that's not where it is. And I'm just, I got to say, particularly, well, not particularly as a thriller writer, particularly as a human, but the way that this is set up and the injustice of this and where this is going to land and who's going to pay the price and the neighborhoods that will is just infuriating to me.
Yeah, because it is those neighborhoods where these people live. And there was a great Twitter response the other day from a young black woman who was like, why are you breaking this stuff? The homeless people who live down the block need that phone charger. The people need those stores. This is our community. Why are you here? And you turn the camera around and it's a whole bunch of white faces standing there.
That's right. And I've been thinking a lot about this, that there's a component, whether that is either spoiled millennial Marxists, which is one narrative. There's evidence of white nationalists infiltrating some of this. The guy who tried to light the historic church on fire, because they know where that'll go and where that will lead. And one of the things that I've been frustrated about, and it's very treacherous grounds to have a conversation about, are the ways in which we are interfering. Let's just take the white nationalists, we know what we think of them, right? They can just be dismissed as not relevant to the national conversation beyond how we just snuff out their participation as much as possible. In terms of the sort of the millennial, the sort of vacation tourism protesting and smashing up of stuff, they're in the way. And that piece that you mentioned, that African-American woman who's talking to them, there's piece after piece like that of people saying, do not do this. This is not us. This isn't what's happening there. And in a weird way, I feel like the overly exuberant response from some of the white protesters who are starting this, it's really infuriating. It's sticking in and escalating a situation they don't know anything about.
Yeah.
And, if you pull other people into the mix, other people are going to get pulled in the mix.
That's an excellent point. But, it also brings up, Greg, and, we've had these, I want to start figuring out how we have these conversations, because look, this isn't my lane. This has never been a topic that I've spent a lot of time talking about. As a an older white guy, this really isn't my lane. So you don't see me out in the streets. I support them. I support the calls for justice. I support the calls for equality, income equality. I support all of that stuff. So how do we have those conversations in a way that can be helpful outside of just having the same kind of conversation that I had all weekend with some of my white friends?
Well, I'd say first of all, one of the things that I think it's important to talk about isn't income inequality, because the opposite of that is income equality, and virtually nobody wants that. I think if we're trying to broaden the tent conversationally, we talk about income injustice, because everybody is aware that there's injustice at the starting gate. Everybody doesn't start out the same way, and we're never going to find that in a way that is perfect. We're never going to get everybody to the starting gate equally, but we have to do everything that we can to try and do that and try and make up for it. And then, of course, allow for some difference of outcome. Some people are going to work harder or innovate more, and that's going to be okay. But what's quintessentially American is trying to get everybody access in some way that's fair. And that's the first thing, is that I think that we have to view this as injustice, very specifically so. And a lot of the issues that get strained through this come down unreasonably hard on different communities. And the other thing I'll say, one of the things we've been hearing from a lot of voices in the African-American community, a lot of my friends and colleagues who are Black are saying, we're having a lot of conversations right now in our community nobody needs the searing, uplifting commentary right now from us. It's like, can you guys have conversations in your community that's meaningful? And that's also hard to do, right? Because who the hell are we? But the one thing that I've started to recognize that I think, have failed at, and it's funny, I've had a number of conversations with my friends who are South African, and there's a frankness that they will talk about and discuss race that's so liberating. And it's like, we tend to forget that you need truth before you can have reconciliation. And part of what I'm seeing that we are failing to do in the conversations among the white community is have anything that approximates a realistic conversation. We are either signaling the fact that anybody who has any racist impulse in their body should be excised, fired, remove them, other them, to use a popular verb, as much as possible to indicate they have nothing on us and that we're no part of them. And there's no reality in that, and there's no cause for reflection. And I know for myself, I've been thinking more about race, and the constitution of my family and community is between me and them, of what they look like and what colors and sizes and shapes everybody is. I have thought more about race in the last couple of weeks than I have probably for a long time, because I've been fairly certain that I'm on the right side of it. And one of the things that I started to realize is that there's no end point. There's no point that you're woke or not woke. There's no point that you're not racist or not. It's an unbelievably complicated relationship.
No, I agree with you. But so the question then comes, because I've had this conversation a number of times, and people are going, well, I don't know what to do. I want to be helpful, and how much is enough? How much do I have to do? Look, I had one guy tell me, look, I want to be with you, but I got to get up and go to work. I got kids I got to deal with. I got all of these problems of my own. I'm struggling to stay on the treadmill just like those folks are. I'm struggling like anybody else, but I want to be helpful. So how do we reach them and use them in a way that will be helpful?
Well, I think there's a couple things. And I think, as always, a lot of it comes from the opposite of what our society with social media is set up to do. What we're set up to do is to constantly broadcast all of our virtue and efforts. And I think part of what we are hearing, and part of what we need to do more, is to be more quiet in our expression of our virtuousness and lack of racism, and take concrete, small, everyday steps within our lives, within our businesses, within our communities, that are concrete things that make a difference, that maybe we don't tweet about and talk about and parade about. And maybe we don't wear that as a source of virtue, but it's something that is reflective that we're doing because it's right. And there's, for me, I've always prided myself, as I say, of being on a certain side of the divide. But I went back and took a kind of moral inventory in the last couple of weeks of going, where are places that I could do more than I haven't, and I haven't looked at it. And the thing that's so hard with this, Rick, is I always think that wisdom is self-adjacent to kind of shame and self-loathing. You have to kind of go through that to learn anything or to move. And I wish that we could lower the bar for people to insight by trying to lower the bar for, shame or learning in places where they might have not seen something in a way that might be as what's the word I'm looking for? Just as they might otherwise have. So instead of sort of shaming them and pointing out how amazing, what paragons of anti-racism we are at every turn, there's a lot of it to help people through and go, you misread that. And, maybe we could have a talk about it. I can understand thinking that way. Like, if people can have a way back to understand that we're all gray and everybody's learning, and that's something we can kind of try to model in the community instead of acting like we're all peerlessly, wonderfully colorblind, maybe that's where the conversation starts. And then we can look at it and go, yeah, I didn't think of it that way. When I pick up the phone for X, often that comes in and that's a white, person who I hire with that. And I could think about that a little bit differently. I'm not going to think about it if you're shaming me that nobody could possibly have those thoughts who's not irredeemable forever. So we have to own our own side a bit more. And those are hard conversations, and everyone's terrified to have them, I think.
No, you're absolutely right on that. Because I know I've had those conversations where people will turn around and go, I can't believe you said that. And go, I'm simply asking a question. And when you can't simply ask a question because you're curious, that's a problem as well. And I hope at some point we can get to the other side of that. You're listening to the Rick Smith Show. We're here with Greg Horowitz, New York Times best-selling thriller author. He's got some great pieces over at The Bulwark. We'll get some links out. Also, check out his website, greghorowitz.net. We'll get that on social media as well. Greg, one of the areas that I've talked about for a long time, because, I grew up a minority in a minority community. So, I grew up in an all-black neighborhood. We used to play this neat game called Chase the White Kid and beat the crap out of him. I'm sure it was a fun game, but it not for me. I always believed that it wasn't about black and white. It was about green. It was about economic power. Because at the end of the day, as a white kid in that neighborhood, I was no better off than anyone else. And over the years, my thinking on that has changed. While I'm still focused on the economic part of this, where I do believe that everyone is entitled to a job, one that can support their life and their family. I am now, I've moved more that there has to be more done. But still, I come back to the economics of it.
Well, economics, I think all the other stuff that can be done is often used as an excuse to avoid addressing economic power. And economic power, in some ways, is the ultimate equalizer, right? Because if you have economics and you have resources, things can change in your communities and in your churches and elsewhere, and in your jobs, in the job structure. And it's so important. My friends who are Cuban American, I've been reaching out to a lot of different communities. I'm liberal. I do a lot of work trying to help the Democratic Party and candidates. But part of why I write at The Bulwark is I've been very interested in talking across the aisle, reaching out to other communities. And it's very interesting because Cuban Americans, a lot of the conversations I've had, it's very much about what are my economic opportunities. I don't care what a president's going to call me. I don't care if there's slurs. If I have economic opportunity, that's what we've learned is everything. So that's one piece. And the other piece I'll say is the class argument is so tricky. The one thing that was really brought home, I think, with the murder of George Floyd is white people are not killed that way in America. White people are shot by cops. There's all sorts of atrocities. Those are all sorts of awful things that happen in the white community. That level of for me, it was like the hands in the pockets. Right. There is a level that is different than anything else. And in some ways, it's easy for us not to embody that in full and to really let in all the way. What's it like if my kid goes out and is driving a nice car and gets pulled over? Like to really go all the way down and embody that. And again, I'm saying this as somebody with all sorts of different people and perspectives in my community. It's just fundamentally different, or a guy who's jogging, hunted down in the street by two guys in a pickup. Their acts of police brutality against white people, they don't look like that. That's a different thing. And there's part of it when I was watching those that I kind of widened the aperture and let that in differently. And again, part of my block of that was that I felt like I already had arrived, and you don't ever arrive. It's sort of like saying, that your marriage is completely fixed, right? You've solved everything. It's like race in America. It's never something we're going to figure out. And so if we can try to be humble and accepting and try to find humility, right? Try to move forward, try to own the places where we go wrong, and try and be gracious in accepting and helping other people when they do that. And I'm not talking about in egregious ways when people are racist, but I'm talking about in trying to have conversations be real. I did a book tour a few years ago to South Africa. I went to the Apartheid Museum, and it was really life-changing for me. I'd never watched the Truth and Reconciliation, I guess hearings. I don't know what you'd call them, but watching Desmond Tutu sort of have the level of discussion that he had with all sides of society as frankly as he did, it's sort of this preternatural, moral authority was what allowed everything to get out. And when it comes out, it's gonna be ugly and complicated and awkward and uncomfortable. And we can't set a tone that anytime that we stumble or admit past problems, which a lot of us are going to have, that we're just excised and removed. That's just another excuse to to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because, there's a lot of talk about removing statues. I hear out in Philadelphia over the weekend, you saw what happened at the Columbus statue. How much of the history that white America learned is going to be have to be rewritten or torn down or any of that. I mean, you got Jeff Sessions, who I don't agree with, but people who grew up in the South, they look at those Confederate generals as heroes of the South. How do you rewrite an entire historical frame?
Stanley McChrystal has a great piece about his changing sort of intellectual and military relationship with Robert E. Lee. And he had a portrait on his wall and how his thinking evolved. And I think it'd be interesting, in a way, it's interesting the evolution of thought that he had about that. There's a lot of options here. I think what makes people nervous is when, how do you fight the balance between an upswell of sentiment and emotion versus doing things in a considered way where the society feels like it can move together? And part of it is some of those monuments, I wasn't aware of this, so I had a very different view. I wasn't aware how many of the monuments were put up during Jim Crow, what the purpose of them was. And, frankly, so part of me started off very skeptical of that, of like, what, are we going to just rewrite the Constitution next? And like, I understand that fear of a slippery slope, but then I'm sort of thinking, like, as an American Jew, if there were all these leftover sort of, statues and stuff to Nazi leadership in German communities in America, that would not sit well with me. And so I think that part of it is can we preserve them? There's a lot of different options. Is there a plaque that explains what it is that they represent? Do we put another statue beside it? Do we put them all in a museum and have a Confederate museum that people can walk through and see both sides of? The Apartheid Museum in Joburg has two entrances. One is for white and one is for black, and you get assigned it at the door arbitrarily to start to feel the experience of what that was like then. So there's ways that we can maintain that and not get rid of our history and try to forget about it, but also have a realization that maybe some of these items that were put forth during Jim Crow to exert continued intimidation on communities need to be addressed differently. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have. And I don't think that it's one that can just uniformly be done in the dead of night, because everyone has to sign in on about that and what we do with it. But I think we're ready to look at it differently, certainly with military installations now.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time we're heading into. Last question I've got, ultimately, are we positive? Are we upbeat that something positive could come from this? Or do you feel, as I have kind of relegated to myself, going, this is another horrible situation, it's another horrible crisis, but sadly, the powers to be are just going to, this will go down the road, and we're going to be no better off down the road. Where do you find yourself?
I have to be. I'm hopeful, and we have an option right now. This has been a horrible 3.5 years, I think, for America in a lot of ways. Our standing overseas, for labor, for income and justice, for African American community, for Hispanic communities. I would like to think that if we can get this right today, if we can turn a page today and get this right, that Donald Trump presidency has the potential to be one of the greatest things that's happened to our country. If moving forward, we respond in a way that is real and authentic, and we figure out that we need to address the tectonic plates and not just slop stuff over on the surface.
Good point.
And there's a lot of things that the Democratic Party, and we don't have time to get into it now, has to answer to also for more standard corruption, more standard, allowing the income gap to widen. And if there is a way that we can take this moment and figure out how to do right by it, get HR1 through and passed, right? Get more of the corruption and money out of our government system, address some of the underlying social injustices that we're still contending with, figure out the strength and importance of our democratic institutions. It would be wonderful if this is a low point that we find, if we can hit bottom here and figure out how to come together as a society. And I'd like to think that that's what's starting to happen here. But you never know when someone's hit the bottom or a bottom, and I'm hoping this is the bottom for us.
I'm right there with you, Greg. I appreciate the time. Great stuff. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again real soon.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Good stuff, Greg Horowitz. Make sure you check out his website, greghorowitz.net. We'll get links out on how you can take a look at that. Also, the 4 articles that he's written over at The Bulwark, we'll also get those out. Quick break, right back. Stick around. Listen to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1908. That was the day that the Executive Board of the American Federation of Labor established its Metal Trades Department. The goal was to coordinate the organizing and legislative efforts of those in the many metal trades. The department joined together workers from sheet metal workers to blacksmiths, iron shipbuilders to brass and silver workers, foundry workers to stove mounters, and more. In all, 600,000 workers were members. The new department held its first convention in Cincinnati, Ohio, that following February. One of the earliest major work projects involving the new department was the construction of the Panama Canal. More than 70,000 workers, including many metal workers, worked on the canal over a decade. By the time the canal was completed in 1914, more than 5,000 workers had died on the project. The metals department often had to navigate an ever-changing demand for the skills of its members. In times of war, as orders for battleships soared, the workers were in high demand. During peacetime, orders fell. In 1945, the U.S. Navy recognized the contribution of metal workers during World War II. They christened the USS Joseph S. McDonough. The ship was named after a former Secretary-Treasurer of the Metal Trades Department who had worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. One of the key victories of the Metal Department was the passage of the 1938 Federal Apprenticeship and Training Act. The year prior, Metal Department President John Fry was appointed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the labor representative for the first Apprenticeship Committee. The act formalized apprenticeship training programs. Today, the Metals Department of the AFL-CIO represents thousands of workers in 17 unions. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So the big story today, obviously, the Supreme Court's ruling, a 6-3 ruling in favor of the LGBT community, and this, basically prohibiting people from being fired or discriminated against based on sex. And I got to tell you, I was shocked at the 6-3 ruling. I was shocked at the fact that Neil Gorsuch came on the other side. But when you read what he wrote, it makes sense. It really does make sense. And here to share some thoughts on this historic Supreme Court decision, I've asked Nick Fish to come talk with us. Nick is the president of the American Atheist Group. Atheist.org is their website. Nick, thanks for taking time for us.
No, glad to be with you, Rick. How are you doing today?
So let's start right from the beginning. How surprised were you by this decision?
Well, I think we were all a little bit surprised. The thing that you have to remember about the Supreme Court justices is their ideological bent. Who appoints them to the bench is not necessarily what's going to drive the opinions that they make, especially when we're talking about something like textualism or some of these decisions that can come out in really unusual ways. And so Gorsuch in particular has been a little bit idiosyncratic, we'll say, on some criminal justice issues, siding with the more liberal justices on certain issues there. Kagan in particular has been someone who, despite being known as a liberal justice, will occasionally side with more expansive interpretations of executive power, or even in religious freedom issues will side with the conservatives. And so you never can quite tell. This is one of those things that I think we were all surprised about, but I don't think we were shocked that Gorsuch would write this decision, having read the decision now. The question was if Gorsuch was going to do what he says, or if he was going to be cynical and approach it from an outcome-based approach to analysis. And what ended up happening is he interpreted the law in the way that he says he does, which isn't always what happens, to be clear. So it's a surprise, but it's not a shock. I think the bigger surprise for me was that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, signed on to this opinion as well. But it's a great day. I mean, let's not
celebrate.
Get into
absolutely.
Yeah, let's not get into psychoanalyzing them. Let's just say this is a heck of a day for LGBTQ Americans.
Gold star for them for doing the right thing today. Let's see what they screw up tomorrow.
Right. That's what we all have to remember is, Anthony Kennedy gave a lot of wins to LGBT Americans, while with the other hand, taking away the right to choose, taking away abortion access for millions of women. So, none of these people are heroes. They're complicated. You never know how these decisions are going to go until they're written.
No, I mean, Gorsuch for me is particularly loathsome because while obviously siding with LGBTQ workers, he decided in the Janus case to screw all public sector workers. So to me, you give it with one hand, take it with the other. But this brings me to the point that, when I read this, I'm going, well, this is great. You can't be fired for being transgender or for being gay, which is stupid to begin with. But you can just be fired for anything else. So even if an employer, it's been my view that in at-will states, which all 50 are, without a union contract, you're an at-will worker. You could be fired for anything else now. So an employer just goes, well, I'm not going to fire you for being gay. I'm just going to fire you for anything else.
Right. And this is the case with anything that's protected under the Civil Rights Act, is a lot of times employers will find a pretextual reason for firing workers. And I think that happens all too often for workers in our society. And that certainly shows the challenges that we have in, so-called right to work states. And I know your position on those. And as the child of two proud public sector union members, I can tell you I'm right there with you, and I understand the frustration. But somebody made the joke, and I wish I could remember who said it, but it was something along the lines of transgender Americans and gay Americans are celebrating the right to lose EEOC complaints at the summary judgment stage as opposed to the motion to dismiss stage, just meaning these lawsuits are still very hard to bring. It's still very hard to prove that you were fired for an impermissible reason. And that's exactly what you were just talking about. But it's important to remember that in places all across this country, that employers will proudly say, they were not ashamed to say, I'm firing you because you're gay. I'm firing you because you're trans. And in I think it was 28 states until today, that was completely legal. And that's, I will take additional protections for workers, even if they come in this piecemeal fashion.
No, absolutely with you on this. And I said from the beginning, this is an historic win. Anything to protect people on the job for me is a win, is a good thing. But ultimately, we need to go even further. While this is good, this is a good day. My fear again is, there are other things that have to be done. That was my point.
Yeah, no, and listen, there are so many injustices, and you were talking about this at the top of the show. There are so many injustices that workers in this country have to deal with in their day-to-day lives, and they disproportionately fall on people who don't have structural power. They fall on people of color, they fall on Black folks, they fall on LGBTQ people, and they fall on them because of history, because of the power of inertia in our society. And a lot of this decision, if you go and read it, especially if you read through, and I would encourage everyone to read this, by the way, for all the things that I dislike about Justice Gorsuch, the one thing that I really do like is his writing is very accessible. He doesn't rely on copious footnotes citing back to untold academic journals. He writes so people can understand what the courts are saying, and I think that's really important. And he goes through point by point his analysis of this, and what he talks about is how in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act passed, no one would have interpreted the Civil Rights Act to include sexual harassment of men by other men in the workplace, as an example. And yet the Supreme Court held that was, in fact, impermissible sex discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. No one at the time would have held that firing a woman because she was too hard charging was a violation of the Civil Rights Act when it was passed. But in PricewaterhouseCoopers, another landmark Supreme Court case on which a lot of this was based, they held that a woman who was fired because she was too assertive, we'll say, in meetings, was fired because on the basis of her sex. And so, the slow march and additional understanding is really important. But at the same time, looking at exactly the reason why people were facing discrimination and why they were fired is something that the courts have to do. And in this case, it's clear 100%. You fired people because of their sex. They fired Amy Stevens because of her sex. They fired Bostock because of his sex. And they fired Zarda because of his sex. It's that simple. And so because of that, the Gorsuch felt very comfortable ruling in a pretty broad ruling in this case.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is, with Gorsuch being the guy writing the decision, he was supposed to be the guy who was going to undo all this stuff. The evangelical community, at the time of his nomination and confirmation, they were basically dancing in the streets. This, I fear, is going to enrage them and going to motivate them to get out and vote in November. I'm curious your thoughts.
I think this goes back to what I was talking about when I first started. Was it's hard to predict these outcomes. It's notable that Gorsuch was not on the original list of Supreme Court nominees put forward by Donald Trump, but he is through and through a Federalist Society member. He was, the religious right groups were talking today, and I saw one person say Gorsuch was grown in a Federalist Society lab. Well, that may be true, but because in many cases the judges are basing their decisions on an actual reasoned reading of the law, and they're not, out and out hypocrites all the time. And because of that, you don't necessarily know how these judges are going to shake out and these decisions are going to shake out in any particular case. It's too hard to read into their ideology on certain motivated policy decisions. And so their decisions in many of these cases will turn on the specific language of the law, or will turn on the arguments that are being made in the briefs, or will turn on the fact patterns of the case itself. It's not necessarily the case that they're going to be hardened out just partisans. They don't necessarily shake out that way, especially when you're talking about Supreme Court justices, and especially when you're talking about people who, have a lifetime appointment and, consider themselves academically rigorous on maybe a trial judge or at the district level, or a circuit judge at the mid-level. You'll sometimes have people that are just out and out partisans, and that's part of the system. Yeah. And that's something that we have to guard against. But at the Supreme Court, it's hard to say. And so I don't know that they're going to necessarily double down and say, okay, now we need to get another person. They're demoralized. And the one thing that the religious right is saying today is they're kind of understanding that they're playing second fiddle to the big business, the corporatist side, because Gorsuch is a reliable vote for the most part.
We all are.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so the religious right has played junior partner for a very long time. But abortion, they've been together with the Republican Party for a very long time. Abortion is still legal. Gay marriage is happening. Transgender people, LGBT people are not being fired from their employment right now because of this decision, and because of the work that has been done by advocates advancing laws. And they're pissed about that. And so they're kind of seeing that their religious motivation, their want of a theocratic society that's based on, quote unquote, Judeo-Christian values, whatever that means, is playing second fiddle to a corporatist agenda to protect the interests of big business. And, I think, let's be clear here, the corporate interest right now is not firing LGBT people. They know that ship has sailed. And right. So the corporate interest is very much in, we're going to put up a pride flag, celebrate pride, where, the greenwashing of pride is certainly something that's very common that is critiqued within the LGBTQ community.
The moneyed interests know how to pave the way with a couple of bucks and a couple of nice words, some pennies and some praise.
Some coupons. Yeah, absolutely.
Some coupons, exactly. But here's the thing. When I saw this today, I saw there were two dissents. One from Samuel Alito, who I see as a complete ideologue, and then one from Justice Kavanaugh. And I go, how unusual is it? Is it rare that there are two dissents in a case like this? I mean, you're the expert. Is it rare?
Well, I don't know if I'd call myself an expert. I'm an interested observer, but it's not that uncommon, honestly. The justices will often write, even if it's so you'll sometimes see decisions where there'll be a long decision, and then there'll be someone concurring in judgment and dissenting on this one piece, and so they're dissenting on the argument that's being made in one section, and so you'll see something like an 8-1 decision with Thomas dissenting because Thomas always dissents, and then you'll see Kavanaugh concurring in judgment, but writing a dissent in Part 4, Section B. And it can sometimes be just as flat as that. It can also be something more complicated. I mean, there are cases, especially around free speech, any of these really tricky, sticky subjects. But the case where they were talking about pornography and talking about things that were rising to that level of obscenity, and where the immortal line, I know it when I see it, was struck. That decision had 7 different writings or 5 different writings, and there was no majority opinion. It was only a plurality opinion. There were enough people voting on one side or the other to make a decision, but no single decision commanded a majority. And so when that happens, you just end up with really messy law. So there'll be what's called a plurality opinion. So there'll be a decision, but the reasoning isn't binding necessarily. And so it gets really complicated. For dissents, though, I mean, everybody can write a dissent if they want to, just laying out their reasoning behind things. And so what happened here, Kavanaugh, looked at the dissent that Alito was writing, decided that he didn't want, his first couple terms in the court burdened with this just spittle-covered raging that Alito was doing, and, wrote a very conciliatory opinion that kind of ended with something along the lines of, the LGBTQ community should be very proud of the work that they've done. They should be proud of this victory. I'm happy for them. However, the courts were not the arena to do this. You should have done this through Congress. That was basically Kavanaugh's writing, whereas Alito, it was just bonkers craziness with appendixes and copies and scans in the middle of a decision, which I have never seen. That is something that I'm sure has happened, but is very uncommon. And it's the reason, by the way, that this decision, when we were trying to download it from the Supreme Court's website, kept crashing the website. Because the decision, the PDF of the decision itself is almost 23 megabytes, because he's got scans of barely legible enrollment papers for enlisting in the military from decades ago. And he felt that was important to include as a scan in his decision rather than just putting it in a footnote. Why? No clue.
Well, he is Samuel Alito, and he is
Samuel Alito.
It is where it is. So last question I've got for you. As a country, at some point, can we now move on from this and give people their rights and not have to continue to litigate and fight this in public and not have this be a divisive political issue? Can we now just say it's accepted?
No, no. So Samuel, the Neil Gorsuch in the decision leaves a couple of landmines for us. He specifically talks about RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that I think a lot of people forget exists. It's a law that was passed in the 1990s to overturn a Supreme Court decision or to kind of modify the analysis that was going to go into those types of decisions. The decision was Employment Division versus Smith, which basically said that any generally applicable law, as long as it's applied neutrally to everybody, can sometimes infringe on people's religious activities, and that's not necessarily unconstitutional. Well, RFRA rolled a lot of that back and is the vehicle that's been used for so many of these cases that we all know nowadays as really bad religious freedom cases. So Hobby Lobby was decided not by the Constitution, but by RFRA, saying that the government has to undergo or use the least restrictive way possible of enacting something, and we have to just take their word for it, take religious folks' word for it if they say, "Oh, this infringes on my rights," to the point where, for the Little Sisters of the Poor case, the nuns who didn't want to provide birth control, they asserted that simply filling out a form to take advantage of an exemption, meaning that if they filled out the form, their employees could still get birth control. They just wouldn't have to pay for it. The government would take care of it. They said filling out that form to take advantage of the exemption that was created for them in the Affordable Care Act was an imposition on their religious freedom because it made them complicit in an evil. And so in Gorsuch's decision, he says, RFRA, we're not ruling on that here because the defendants, the employers here, didn't bring that up. So we're limiting our analysis to what's the facts that are in front of us. However, and this is where things get kind of scary, he says, quote, because RFRA operates as a kind of super statute, displacing the normal operation of other federal laws, it might supersede Title VII's commands in appropriate cases. He's basically saying, here's how you bring this to us next time if you want to get out of this. And this is a concern because there are cases before the court this term that implicate this. And so one of the really big ones that's out there still is a case called Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe School versus Agnes Morrissey Baru. Morrissey Baru was a religious teacher, or she was a teacher at a religious school, excuse me. And the school, Our Lady of Guadalupe, said, oh, no, she's a minister of the faith. And the reason they're saying that is because they wanted to fire her. And now this is a consolidated case with Daryl Beal, and I can't remember which one is which, but one of them was fired because they raised a complaint under the Americans with Disability Act, and one of them was raised a complaint for another reason, and they were fired after years of good service. They weren't even Catholic themselves, but they were fired because the court said, well, you don't have to be, the school said, you don't have to be Catholic to teach here. You just have to follow our things. And they read like a devotional each day. And what the schools are arguing is that simply reading the devotional, if you're a math teacher or a history teacher, reading that devotional to your students makes you a minister of the faith, and we should be entitled to absolute immunity from anything that protects workers. And so even the very limited set of worker protections that we have, these schools don't want to have to follow them. They're flat out coming out and saying, it doesn't matter if we're firing this person for a discriminatory reason. It doesn't matter if we're retaliating against them for filing a complaint under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It doesn't matter because now that we're calling them ministers of the faith. And that's a really dangerous position for us to be in, because now schools, hospitals, all of these groups, these nonprofit groups that are affiliated with religious entities, and that's why American Atheists is so concerned about this, they're going to just reclassify everyone as a minister of the faith. They're going to say the person working in the front office, the secretary who answers the phone, the janitor, anybody is a minister of the faith because it's important that they uphold the precepts of the school. And then they can fire them for any reason.
Yeah, because they have their sincerely held beliefs. You know it's coming. Nick, I appreciate
it. And it's absolutely happening. Like this decision could come down any day. And so we're prepared for it. But, this is something that people need to keep an eye out on.
And when it does, we want to have you back so you can share it with us. Nick, I appreciate the time. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, Rick. Good to be with you.
Good stuff. Nick Fish, president of the American Atheists. Make sure you check out their website, atheists.org. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back. Stick around. This is The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1990. About 400 janitors were protesting at Century City, a large office complex in Los Angeles. It was part of SEIU's Justice for Janitors campaign in LA. The janitors had gone out on strike against international service systems. The strike had started on May 30th, and despite promises that they would not interfere with the protest, the LAPD showed up wielding batons. They demanded the janitors immediately vacate the premises. But instead of dispersing, the protesters linked arms, and in a show of solidarity, they marched toward the 150 police dressed in riot gear. Police responded by savagely beating protesters, clubbing people on the ground as they tried to stand back up. One demonstrator, who was 3 months pregnant, suffered a miscarriage caused by the police beating. The media recorded the brutal attack. Coverage spurred outrage at the actions of the police that day. It also made the janitors more determined than ever to win a contract. Public pressure resulted in a new contract with a $2 an hour raise for the janitors. They also won family health care coverage. SEIU filed suit over the police conduct, and 3 years later, the LA City Council awarded the union more than $2.3 million. But the police did not have to admit guilt for the attack. 200 janitors gathered on the steps of City Hall to await the settlement decision. Joel Vasquez, one of the janitors who was beaten on that day, addressed the crowd saying, "The people who are supposed to protect us didn't. They beat us." Today has become a day of commemoration of the janitors' struggle. In 2001, janitors gathered in LA to remember that past victory and rally for economic justice. One marcher carried a sign that read, "What's dignity? New shoes for my daughter, a birthday party for my son." Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So, I look at this decision, and as I said, this is another one of those employment decisions that this time went the right way, but ultimately Gorsuch should not be, applauded or patted on the back for this. He just did the right thing. This is a guy who went after public sector workers and took away basically the rights of folks to have a closed shop union, which, to me is one of those things that you absolutely have to have in order to negotiate with employers. Once they know they can divide and conquer, it's over. So for me, not a great Gorsuch, not a great guy, but I'll tell you, the evangelical community, little unsettled by this, because as they've pointed out, abortion's still legal. And now gay marriage is still legal, and now you can't fire them for being gay. You can fire them for other things, as any of us can be fired for any reason without a union contract. And for me, it all comes back to that contract. It comes back to the economic power. It comes back to the ability to fight fire with fire. And, as Nick pointed out, Gorsuch is all in on the corporate side. This is why, to me, it's still the economics, whether it's in the African American community, the LGBT community, or any other community. It's about the economic power. I'd love to hear your thoughts, though. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Right back.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
Viewing the video of George Floyd's gruesome murder, one word from him stuck in my head, one painful human utterance that conveys the horror of it all. "Mama," Mr. Floyd cried out in desperation and disbelief as his life was cruelly and senselessly suffocated in yet another white-on-black slaying by so-called officers of the law. This can't be America, can it? Yes and no. Certainly it can't be the America we accept, one totally antithetical to our people's deeply held democratic values of justice for all. Yet, from the founding of the nation forward, the official knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd has been a common experience for African Americans and also for Latinos, Native Americans, and other people of color. It's that stark separation between the American ideal and reality, now so vividly and violently thrust in our faces, that has ignited such a diverse, massive, and furious protest from coast to coast. To me, this outpouring of public anguish feels different than previous ones, for the protesters are not only angry about what the power establishment did to George Floyd, they're also angry for themselves. The intentional spread of inequality in America is now swamping the once middle-class majority. So more and more people, especially among the young, are feeling the establishment's knee crushing their opportunities, rights, and lives too. More than empathy for the black community, there's now a shared inkling that the rise of autocracy and plutocracy is engulfing all but the moneyed elites, threatening the existence of America itself. This is Jim Hightower saying, there's a rising political awareness that today's social order is corrupt, and the system itself must be changed, not tinkered with, but fundamentally changed. And there's a growing understanding that we really are all in this together, so we've got to stand up for George Floyd, each other, and the America we want.
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So evidently tomorrow, Donald Trump's going to sign an executive order outlining his vision. Evidently, he's had a vision on what police reform is going to look like in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. The early response at this point is that there are going to be three areas that the executive order will focus on. One, that will give credentials and certify police officers. Another will create a database to track accusations of misconduct by officers and ultimately allowing them to jump from one department to another. And the other one is evidently sending out social workers with law enforcement on calls with anyone that they suspect has a mental illness. Again, window dressing, yeah, but something. And here to share some thoughts on where we are and maybe something on the executive order, I've asked our good friend Propane Jane to come talk with us. Jane, thanks for taking time for us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me back.
So let's start with the executive order. Thoughts?
Honestly, I don't care what Trump has to say about any of this. I mean, is that terrible? I just feel like nothing he offers is going to actually be a workable solution to anything. And I think that the culture itself, police culture itself, cannot be separated from the larger societal culture and the broader conversation we need to be having about everything that was just mentioned in the Hightower commentary right there. I mean, all of the systemic, institutionalized oppression that goes on in America on multiple fronts, not just in regard to black people, but across the spectrum. I mean, we're talking about the Supreme Court and LGBTQ rights, and there's always this, theme in the air of people struggling for just basic equality. And that is what still dominates our whole public psyche. And so I think whatever Trump announces, okay, fine, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he is a cancer in the White House and he is propagating so much of the hatred and inciting so many of these hate crimes and the lawlessness that we're seeing across the board from just regular civilians and also people in law enforcement and in our government.
Yeah. Let me ask you, because, there's this big move right now to defund the police departments. I've actually had people saying we should be disbanding police departments. There's been a bunch of ideas floating around. I'm curious if you have thoughts on them.
I mean, I think that the police are certainly a necessary part of our society, and I think the reason why, just hearing the words defund the police immediately sparks all of this controversy when people just take that soundbite and extrapolate it to whatever their wildest imagination adds onto it. But I think, when you get into the argument and you get into the policy itself and you look at city budgets, county budgets, and how much money is devoted to policing certain segments of the population for, whatever, reasons they have on paper, but then ultimately when you juxtapose that with what the statistics are on paper, and how that translates into racial profiling and the violence and the police brutality and these murders that are happening, it's not a coincidence. And so all of those things go together, and the conversation is just a really nuanced conversation that really just can't be reduced to a three-word soundbite of defund the police. I think it really ultimately is a question of how that money is apportioned and where the police are having the most value, where they're allocated, and what they're actually necessary for. What is the bulk of their work doing?
Right. No, this is where there's part of me as I was reading the arguments, not to
Yeah.
cut you off, but as I was reading the different arguments, and there's some good thought that goes into that idea of taking the money that they spend on over policing and actually invest in communities, and go back to George H.W. Bush's midnight basketball ideas of having
Right,
programs in those communities. Maybe
Right.
going back to when I was a kid, where you had school lunch programs during the summer, so
Yeah.
that kids could get meals. Where Reagan destroyed that kind of stuff.
Right, right.
That kind of investment, but also talking about what it is that police are doing.
Exactly.
And this is again a failure in my view of the leadership of local governments to give police some guidance and direction on what they're supposed to be doing,
Right.
and not being on the ground social workers. So to give Trump a little bit of credit, if I have to, the fact
Yeah.
that he's saying in this executive order that you're going to have mental health professionals going along seems somewhat like maybe he's listening a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a maybe, and then ultimately, again, when you drill down into it, it doesn't actually make any sense because, again, while he's doing that, out of one side of his mouth, out of the other side of his mouth, and the precedent that has been set is that they've loosened the restrictions on people with a history of, being dangerous to themselves or others being able to have access to firearms.
Right.
So you can't, on one side of your mouth, say, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to put a social worker with the cops, which ultimately, to me, the cops seem to be unsafe. So when I hear that, I think about my colleagues, my social work colleagues who serve, as very competent, honorable members of our team, who ultimately you're going to throw in the middle of harm's way with the trigger-happy police who still want to shoot people. So ultimately, how are we addressing the bellicosity and the trigger happiness of the officers themselves, so that a ride-along and having, again, crisis intervention teams are not new. That's something that already happens. I work very intimately with crisis intervention teams that already have embedded police that understand this, the confluence of criminal justice and mental health. They have to be trained. They have to have a certain amount of continuing education, de-escalation techniques that go along with their job. So to just say you're going to put people on the ride-along, that's not really addressing the systemic issues that we're still dealing with of you've caused a recession. You have now millions of people who are out of work, who don't have jobs, who don't have food, who are now being brutalized in the streets. And again, this is what we talk about when, we were just talking about this around the midterms, in regards to remember the caravans
Sure.
coming from down south, and that was the big story. Like we talked about how we withdraw foreign aid and get real isolationist in terms of how we spend money in those countries, and then we sort of act surprised when the money that we were sending that was actually meant to keep people educated and fed and having jobs, et cetera, and moving up socioeconomically so that they don't have idle times on their hands to be out there doing the devil's work and becoming terrorists, essentially. But again, we've created this situation in our own cities because we've divested from them, and we've done it along these demographic lines of redlining and, the way we have the school district situated along Jim Crow, but just not really calling it Jim Crow. And ultimately, you put guns, you put drugs, you put lack of public health infrastructure, lack of public education, and you just have this perfect storm of disaster. So it's such a bigger issue than him issuing some executive order with 3 planks, as if that ultimately erases, the last 50 years of this very austere Republican economic agenda that clearly puts us into disaster every time they put it into place.
Right. But here's my problem, and this is where the defund the police thing kind of breaks down for me. In a lot of neighborhoods, especially in a neighborhood that I live in, sure, okay, you could disband the police department here. You probably wouldn't have much of an uptick in crime. But if you were to do that where I grew up, bad things would happen. Being a cop is a tough job. It's a dangerous job, and to say that there aren't bad people out there that they're trying to deal with is kind of naive, don't you think?
Oh, for sure, it's naive. But again, I think again we have to think about what we are calling crimes, what we are calling things that need to be policed, and where exactly we have, imagined these things happen. Because again, I'm calling in from Texas,
Right.
so a lot of what I do in mental health, a lot of what I see in forensics, in my interactions with the police, in my interactions with my patients, is that in the rural community, the same scene that we sort of imagine when you think about your typical Law and Order that's set in New York or that's set in this very urban scene. You think about Chicago, you think about Detroit, all of these sort of stereotypic cities that everybody conjures up in their minds when they think about crime, when they think about drugs, when they think about just the social strife of society. But again, we're not talking about these rural white communities, these inner city, predominantly white communities, again, where we have huge meth epidemics, we have huge opioid epidemics, we have gun violence, we have suicide by gun, we have homicide by gun, we have domestic violence, we have violence against children. We have all of these things. We have failing public health infrastructure.
Certainly.
In the rural communities, in the same way that we have them in black communities, in Native American communities, in Latino communities. And so we don't think about it as a global problem in our society that happens socioeconomically when you have been divested from as a community, that again, is happening to all of us, but the way our frame of mind is that we got to send the police to the inner city because this is where this is happening only, whereas the same stuff is happening in the direction that they're not going. But they're not sending the police and a brigade and riot gear out to those communities. They're decriminalizing those behaviors in those communities. So that's why the opioid epidemic is now this thing that we need to treat suddenly from a public health perspective.
Yeah.
As opposed to how the crack cocaine epidemic was treated, whereas we needed to put, quote unquote, all of these people behind bars.
Yeah, I've talked about that for a while. When I was a kid, the guy we found dead on the side of the house with a needle in his arm, he was a junkie. Now, our junkies are now in need of, what was the phrase I saw? Abuse, or, what was it? Abuse disorder, use disorder.
Right.
I guess it is now the new word for junkie or addict. And now we're treating it, like you said, as a medical condition instead of, these people are junkies.
Right, exactly. And I think you have to, when you talk about this era of policing, you really do have to dig into the policies themselves. You have to think about all of the revelations that have been made in regards to just Nixon. I mean, his aides came out and flat out said that the war on drugs was a tool to target black people and hippies. That's a quote.
Yeah, because those were the people in my neighborhood who you found dead on the side of the house with a needle in their arm.
Exactly. And instead of, really talking about how those drugs, quote unquote, mysteriously made their way into those communities, and then a whole era of policing was tailored to match this sort of paradoxical, dare, get kids off drugs, this is your brain on drugs, effort that was made, right? I mean, and I'm a kid of the 80s.
Yeah, I didn't need the commercial. I saw the guy on the street.
Exactly.
I saw the junkies walking up and down the street, which again is, I looked at them and I saw, one, they need help, they need treatment, they need all of that, and
right.
They needed to be accessible. But moreover, they need freaking jobs, in which, my position has always been on race or any other issue. It's all economics.
Yeah, for sure.
People need jobs, and I just had this conversation over the weekend where I said the worst thing that ever happened to the black community, and you can agree or disagree, but in my opinion, the worst thing that ever happened was welfare. There should have been no handout program to anyone. If you want to eat, you have to work. And if the private sector refuses to create enough jobs or can't create enough jobs, the public sector has to. As a kid growing up in the projects, all the people I ever knew, they wanted jobs. They wanted opportunity to support themselves and to move forward. And as my grandmother always said, idle hands is the devil's work. And sadly, we see that happen over and over again.
Well, but what are we calling welfare, though? Because if we're calling welfare Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare.
No, I'm not calling that. I'm calling handout programs like I had when I was a kid. When my mother would lose her job, we went on food stamps. I was, to this day, I'm 53 years old. I still remember being an 8-year-old kid having to walk to the local store with the clown money and being just absolutely humiliated. And I want that for no child ever to have to go through that. And, for me, it's always been about, work is that thing, I think, that gives people self-worth. It gives them pride. It gives them a sense of accomplishment and keeps people off the street.
Yeah, but I think that's also the dynamic and the stigma that gets attached to any sort of social program because, again, when we talk about these policies, when we talk about SNAP benefits or the EBT card or the origins of those programs in the beginning, America didn't start by just willfully handing things out to black people. They willfully handed them out to white people.
Sure. No,
right?
And I didn't say white or black. And what again solidified my view, over my vacation, I happened to watch this horrible documentary that I can't believe I hadn't seen until now. It was done back in 2009. It's called the Wild, Wonderful Whites of West Virginia. And it was all about this horrible family in Boone County, West Virginia, who their entire existence has been sucking off the government teat for their entire existence. I guess the father, 50 years ago, figured out how to get people Social Security when they were children. And they ended up, never working, one of them. And to me, there's nothing worse than going through a community where there are just people sitting around doing nothing. There's nothing good in that, in my view.
Right, but again, I think that's the slippery slope, right? I mean, this is the argument that we continue to have, I think, as a society. When you start talking about FDR and the New Deal and progressivism and what a Bernie revolution or what that type of, when you talk about single payer and you talk about, adding an entire set of what a lot of people, even if it's different, even if it has all of these new, sort of modernized, evolved ways of preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, ultimately there's still a mentality, there's still an aura about it that, makes certain people, for certain reasons, feel like, oh, this is an icky thing that, people shouldn't have. Whereas some people may see it as, this is a stepping stone for me. They may never have felt shame attached to, having that thing because that gave them a leg up and that was what gave them, food on their table so they could get through school, so they could actually go to college and be the first in their family to go to college.
So let me clarify my position on this, because we seem to be having a heated agreement. I'm not opposed to people getting the health care that they need. I'm not opposed to people having a roof over their head. I'm not opposed to people being fed. It is my view, though, that there has to be, to go back to Mayor LaGuardia's statement, and I guess it's almost biblical as well. If you want to eat, you got to work. You've got to do something. And if it is going to school, then yes, we pay you to go to school. If it's washing the neighborhood bus stop 3 times a week, it's washing the neighborhood bus stop. If it's checking in on 3 senior citizens in your neighborhood, it's got to be tied to some accomplishment and some responsibility. For a couple of reasons. One, it gets rid of the stigma that you're just getting something for nothing. But 2, it gives people something to do and, I believe, a bit of self-worth. My problem is growing up like I did, I saw a lot of people who were beaten down by a system who didn't allow them to do any better. It threw men out of the homes. It saddled women into these horrible situations, and it didn't give them that opportunity out. So for me, this idea of government being the employer of last resort just seems like common sense.
Well, I agree, but again, I think that goes back to the larger issue of why this issue doesn't move forward in American society and how we get gridlocked politically around this very concept that you're describing. Because like you're saying, I totally agree with you, and we're saying very much the same thing, but the idea of holding people down, I think that's so important what you're saying. The idea of holding a certain percentage of the population down by cutting them off from economic achievement, educational attainment, on purpose for centuries, right? I mean, that is the slave owner mentality. It's like I always say that, and we always talk about this when you talk about the slave quarters on the tour that you went on when you went through the South, and how ultimately the irony is that those white people who were not enslaved but that were poor and that were sharecroppers were not able to make a living because they couldn't compete with the, cheap labor, free labor of slavery. And so we find ourselves in a similar situation today. Certainly the dynamics have changed, and we don't necessarily have chattel slavery in that same way, but we certainly have millions of people who serve as this like undocumented underclass of people who can be, discriminated against and nothing happens, right? Because they actually don't function in this society. They don't have a social security number.
Right.
So we have, in a lot of ways, recreated those same dynamics today, and it's at this boiling point, I think, where, it's not necessarily anything one person, one government, whether it be at the local level or the state level, can do in a patchwork quilt. I mean, it really does have to be a nationwide reconciliation. We talk about reparations all the time, and everybody poo-poos it and go, well, no, we can't talk about that. That's too radical. Well, the gears of society are grinding to a halt right now because the rubber has met the road.
Right. Look, I'm not against the idea of reparations. In the way of, rebuild communities, give people jobs, invest in education, invest in those communities.
Exactly.
I'm not against that at all.
Yeah.
I think anything we can do to get people employed, anything we can do to lift up communities and give people hope, I think is a great thing. For instance, I'll tell you, I think some of the Section 8 housing things were bad ideas of giving people, better rents. How about making sure that people can own their homes and have some pride in ownership and also building wealth? How about, doing some of those things instead of just figuring out how, the Donald Trumps of the world can line their pockets?
Absolutely. And what happened to Infrastructure Week?
Yeah, we have that every week. We just don't do anything about it.
I mean, ultimately, we're in this matrix, and this is why I'm always, reminding people of what reality are we actually in? Are we in, real reality, or are we in this fabricated, manufactured, political reality where we don't have all of these New Deal-like projects around the country that really do need to be done and have needed to be done for decades now. Right,
and this is why I say we need a new WPA, a new CCC, something like that. I've got a great great-grandparent, that's how they made it through the Depression.
Exactly.
My grandfather's father, my grandmother's father, his job was going up Main Street in Berea, putting bricks down. His job was laying the bricks, and then when they got 6 miles down the road, turn around and flip them over.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is what we need to be doing, and we could be doing this in communities all over America. It doesn't matter whether you're a red state or a blue state or whether you're black or white or whatever. We need to actually just go, hey, this country is big enough for all of us that are here. We actually aren't even, we don't even have a birth rate that's slated to keep up with, what we actually need to keep our population going over time.
Right.
So that's not really the issue. We need to stop being racist in terms of our foreign policy, in terms of our immigration policy. We need to stop being racist in terms of our criminal justice system, in terms of our education system. We need to stop being misogynistic. I mean, we need to get rid of all of these isms that ultimately are stopping us from living up to our fullest potential as a country. And, you know, we would be having these conversations, and it would be like normal if we didn't have all of these idiots and all of these regressives and these haters and these bigots, honestly, running our government and doing it with impunity and getting away with just a very, you know, large volume of corruption and sociopathy every single day.
Yeah, again, it all comes back to this administration. And look, you know, some of the administrations we've seen across the country, at the end of the day, the people that we elect and we put into the halls of power are the ones who've done this. And sadly, you know, they've done it because this is what the moneyed interests want.
Exactly. And we have to, you know, get back to our votes actually matter. I get that they've done everything they can to make our votes not matter and to make corporations people. I get all of that. But that, again, is an alternate reality. We still have the vote. We still have it if we can hang on to it long enough to get these people out of office. And we actually do need to vote by mail or do whatever we need to do to vote early, however we need to do it safely in the context of the pandemic, but to actually use our power and have a government that's actually by, for, and of the people like we're supposed to have it.
There you go. As always, time goes way too quick. I had so much I wanted to get to, but it will be here for the next time. Jane, I appreciate the time. As always, great stuff, and I appreciate you coming on and talking with us.
You too. Have a great week and be safe.
Good stuff. Our good friend Propane Jane. Love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Right back after this. Stick around.
Saving work in America, one show at a time. The Rick Smith Show.
It's Thursday, June 11, 2020.
You can't get around solutions, real solutions, without talking about justice and equity.
Major environmental organizations embrace racial justice after the killing of George Floyd. Communities of color disproportionately at risk from climate change impacts. Britain has gone coal-free for 2 straight months. Plus,
a neighborhood in Palm Beach Gardens is overrun with thousands of poisonous toads.
Step aside, murder hornets. Get ready for the poisonous giant toxic toad invasion.
All of those stories and more straight ahead from BradBlog.com. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
Stand by for 6 minutes of independent green news, politics, analysis, and snarky comment.
Put your toes down, folks. Thousands of toxic toads are taking over one South Florida community.
Oh my God. Global pandemic, plagues of locusts, murder hornets, and now giant toxic toads? What's happening? This is your Green News Report. Okay, Desi Doyen, from my Passover services, I do recall that toads were one of the 10 plagues, along with plagues of locusts and everything else.
Oh, I know. And I bet you didn't have poisonous toxic toad invasion on your apocalypse bingo card.
No, I guess I didn't.
In South Florida, ecologists are warning that an unusually warm and rainy spring has created perfect conditions for a population boom of poisonous giant cane toads, also known as bufo toads. They're an invasive...
What kind of toads?
Bufo toads.
Okay.
They're an invasive species introduced in Florida in the 1930s with skin that contains enough poison to kill large dogs. Cane toads damage entire ecosystems, crowding out native species, and have become a serious problem in Australia.
So the more warm and wet weather we have, the more bufo giant toxic toads we're going to have.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess it is another climate change story.
In other news, as demonstrations in the U.S. and around the world continue against systemic racism in reaction to the police killing of George Floyd, major environmental organizations are examining the lack of diversity in their own overwhelmingly white staff and membership. The Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, and other big green groups over just the last few weeks have committed to racial justice as inextricably linked to environmental justice and climate action.
Good.
The Sierra Club this week published an article titled "Racism is Killing the Planet," saying, quote, "The ideology of white supremacy leads the way toward disposable people and a disposable natural world." And, quote, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism."
You have been reporting for years that it is minority communities in the U.S. and, of course, around the world who are most affected by pollution, by climate change. At least they are the first and worst affected.
Exactly. And environmental racial disparities are borne out by data that shows minority communities disproportionately bear the brunt of industrial air pollution. According to the Trump EPA's own data, Americans of color are subjected to far higher levels of air pollution than white Americans, regardless of their wealth.
Oh, well, I'm sure that Trump's EPA will take action on that right away.
Also, a new analysis of federal data confirms that communities of color and low-income neighborhoods are also disproportionately exposed to the impacts of man-made global warming. The Centers for Disease Control keeps a list of the top 10 U.S. counties most vulnerable to extreme weather disasters, and the new analysis shows that the population of the most vulnerable counties is, on average, 81% minority. The top 10 counties most vulnerable to extreme heat are 61% minority.
Which county is the top?
For natural disasters, Texas takes the top 3 counties.
Of course.
And for extreme heat, counties in Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, and Georgia take the top 4. Dr. Robert Bullard, known as the father of the environmental justice movement, in a recent PBS NewsHour interview, said that successfully solving climate change and environmental justice requires addressing racial justice.
You can't get around solutions, real solutions, without talking about justice and equity. Which communities are vulnerable, which communities have contributed least to the crisis, but are feeling the pain right now, first, worst, and longest. How can we make sure that our plans do not further marginalize already vulnerable population by creating plans that somehow exacerbate that vulnerability and create more problems for that quote, invisible group, the group that may not necessarily be in the room when they're deciding what to build and where to spend monies. That's the justice part.
Finally, the BBC reports that the nation of Britain has now gone a full 2 months without burning coal for electricity.
Wow.
For the first time since the 1880s. In 2020, renewables have generated more power in Britain than all fossil fuel sources combined. The UK now has the biggest offshore wind industry in the world, part of the dramatic transformation of its energy system over just 10 years. It's another example of what can be achieved when, we try.
Yeah, but Charles Dickens would have had nothing at all to write about.
True.
For much more on all of these stories and the many we couldn't get to today, please check out our website at greennews.bradblog.com. Find us, follow us, and share us planet-wide on the Facebooks and the Twitters at Green News Report. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
And this has been your Green News Report.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So, 4th of July just around the corner, and the topic of, the chest thumping and the number one finger waving going on. It's right around the corner for us. And this new poll out by Gallup doesn't really show that we're going to be doing much of the chest thumping. Evidently, only 63% of U.S. adults say that they're either extremely or very proud to be an American. That is a 7-point decline from last year, and it is the lowest figure since Gallup began tracking this all the way back in 2001. And again, it's just one of those little things where, global pandemic, riots in the streets, people are feeling a little tense. And, you look at what's going on with the leadership in D.C., of which there is very little. I guess it gives people the feeling of, I don't know. I feel proud to be an American. I don't know that I don't think I'm extremely anything, but I'm proud to be an American. But I wouldn't go with the extreme. Anyway, here to share some thoughts on the news of the day, our good friend, former Congressman Bob Ney. Bob, thanks for taking time for us.
Thank you, Rick.
So where are you on the proud scale? Somewhere in the very extreme, or somewhere in the maybe not so much?
Can I change the word to happy?
There you go. Happy.
Happy?
Happy is a good one.
Happy to be an American.
That's where I would put myself as well.
Somewhere else. Right.
No, that's a good frame.
Sure.
I'm happy.
I'm happy.
So what we see now, 9 states.
Right.
9 states have reported record coronavirus infections. You have Florida, you've got Alaska, Arkansas, California, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and South Carolina, all leading the new increases. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, it can be. It could be a lot of factors too. Of how they opened versus other states. Some of it, can be numbers that I would want to look at also. I think it's rising, but I would still look also at the amount of recovery and also the death rate.
Right.
I think that has to be looked at. For example, Ohio has 75% of our numbers are in the nursing homes and prison system. So, I mean, this is something that's going to continue to be debated, but I thought there'd be actually a few less cases because of the heat. Supposedly during the hot season, it doesn't happen as much.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. But but Donald Trump has a solution. Just stop testing.
Yeah,
if we didn't test anymore, we wouldn't have any new cases, Bob.
Well, the testing is bleak anyway. I mean, I saw an advertisement here the other day in Ohio where, if you want to be tested, you can be tested. Well, I don't know about that. Kind of good luck on testing here and there around the country.
Yeah, and sadly, some of the tests aren't all that reliable.
Right. In fact, I had scheduled to get a test in Tip City, Ohio, when I saw it advertised, and they ended up, the test was $95. It jumped to $195, and then the actual testing company was being disputed, so I canceled that.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where I thought the testing was supposed to be covered. I thought we were paying for the testing. Go get tested. No.
I don't think so, because I can't find around here anyway something that would be a free test, and that's why I signed up for the Tip City, and then again it jumped overnight from 95 to 195.
Wow.
Right. So I just said, okay, forget it.
No, that's because we don't want you to go get tested, Bob. We don't want you to know if you got it or not, so that you can spread it if you don't have any symptoms, and ultimately we can get rid of you because you're over to 65 now and you're on Medicare.
Right. Right.
And you're a drain to our society.
Right.
You were useful years ago, not so much anymore. I guess that seems to be the
still
thought.
Happy, I guess.
Still happy. Nothing wrong with being happy. This should make you happy. Evidently, Trump has called John Bolton, called Bolton's book inappropriate, and said that there could be some very strong criminal problems that he might have with the book.
Well, I was all over Bolton, as you know, on your show and all over the place for the last year that he was in the White House. In fact, I predicted he would be booted before the end of the summer. He was. I had a lot of people that would message me, and they would see me, and they would say, what's wrong with you, Bolton? Okay. Well, I've never thought he's okay, for the first time I met him. I used to also say that when I thought of John Bolton, I thought of Shakespeare's line, when I feel the twitching in my thumb, something this wicked way comes. And that's how I always thought of John Bolton. The prolific note-taking, by the way, because they talk about his book, when I met with him, when he came he requested to meet with me the first time when I was in office, and he wouldn't stop taking notes. And I noticed that, somebody sitting talking to you, and they've got a yellow pad taking all these notes. But people got all over me for it, and then I thought, wonder where those people are at today. They were like the Bolton lovers, and I'm sure because they love Trump that they're not real happy with Bolton. He's got this, tell-all book, and he was, of course, with the advisor for the National Security Agency, and people say, well, it's not appropriate he does this or that. But what they're talking about is he is referencing his own notes, and they're saying that might be, illegal, and that he should have ran things by the NSA. Well, he actually did run some things by the NSA. And president's just not going to like the book, because the book is not going to be flattering, not just the Ukraine, but other times that Trump has dealt with world figures. There's going to be information. I'm told in that book that is not going to be complimentary. So I'm kind of surprised. What word did the president use for the book? It's inappropriate?
Inappropriate. And
That's
said that he would have strong criminal problems.
I don't think he's going to have criminal problems over it.
Yeah, and another book coming out, evidently, is I guess his niece, this Mary Trump, is coming out and coming out with a book. Also admitted, I guess, being the one who leaked all of the tax stuff to everyone. So a bunch of books coming out, not making Donald all that happy.
I saw that, and also in his niece, in her book, also is claiming different quotes that are derogatory to him by his sister, who was a judge. That's going to be in there.
Yeah, so
kind of interesting book time.
Yeah, as I asked, how long is it going to be before he says he doesn't know who she was, or she's a loser, or she's just a member of the fake media?
Met her. Right, never met her.
She just went to get coffee. I don't know who she's at. But hey, it is what it is. I also, again, I wanted to get your thoughts on the big rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Evidently, according to the email I got from one of the idiot sons, 800,000 people have requested tickets to the 19,000 seat arena there in Tulsa, Oklahoma, an area that has just about 1 million people that live in there. 80% of them want to come.
Well, it is very possible. I don't think 800,000. It is possible they had a couple of 100,000, because there's this is kind of cute if you think about it. There's this Twitter system that people have, and when he has a rally now, they put it out there, and so if you don't like him, you request tickets.
Okay.
Then you have the ticket, and you don't go.
Ah.
And so, statistically, maybe of the 19,000, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 are people that are not going. So, when the event will be held, because it's by ticket only, there'll be 3,000 or 4,000 empty seats is the goal.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah. So it's not 800,000 people who want to go, but the Twitter network and the Instagram network, Facebook, has had people who don't like Trump will go ahead and request that ticket, hoping they are selected for that ticket. They don't go, and it's a bunch of empty seats. So it's possible. I don't think 800,000 people did it, but it's possible a lot of people did it to try to do that, so there'll be some empty seats.
Yeah, it just seems like too much work to me, and I really don't care. I'm not going to watch the rally. I wouldn't show up to it. But evidently, they're going to hand out masks. They're going to take people's temperatures at the door. And there will be hand sanitizer available, but you don't have to use the hand sanitizer or the mask.
And, of course, you sign a paper that you won't sue.
Of course.
You do have to sign a paper that you won't sue.
Of course. But we also find out that the RNC is moving the whatever they're going to have as a convention from Charlotte, North Carolina, down to somewhere in Florida, right?
Jacksonville, Florida. They're going to do that. Now, they're actually still going to, Rick, they're going to still have sort of two conventions, part of it in Carolina there and part of it in Florida. But the business will be held where it originally was going to be held in the Carolinas, but the actual acceptance speech, etc., is going to be in Jacksonville, Florida.
Oh, so we could have a big rally and basically a big rally.
Well, yes, because down in Jacksonville, the leaders the government leaders have said, come and bring who you want, and so as a result, that's where it'll be. But the actual business will still be held where they originally had planned the convention.
Yeah, because originally I had hoped to go to the conventions. I'm not going to go to any of the conventions.
I have actually a friend of mine who is begging me to go to both conventions. Of course, as you know, you and I were at the convention 4 years ago, but I just don't think I'm going to do it.
Yeah, I wanted to go. wanted to go through the whole harass thing. And I just decided last minute going, too risky.
Right.
I'll watch it online like everybody else. And finally, Joe Biden's raising a boatload of money, $81 million in May, up $20 million from April. Good for him, right?
Well, right. There's two things that are indicators here. Of course, one is that he's raising money, and he's going to need the money because Trump will be well financed, obviously, sitting as an incumbent president and with the money machines cranking up. But it's good for Biden that he is raising. If he wasn't, it would be a bad indicator. And then second is the polling. Now, he's ahead. The polling's wild in Ohio, which the wild results in either direction in a way. But I still think that's good for Joe Biden. It really is. He's up in some of the polls in Ohio and down in some of the polls, but it's still overall is a good indicator.
Yeah, any chance Biden wins Ohio?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Any chance Biden wins Ohio?
Well, in the Baldwin-Wallace poll, with the college poll, he's not by 4 points, which is interesting. And in some of the other polls, he's actually winning Ohio, which is interesting. So there is a possibility that he could. Obama, of course, did. So, we'll have to see where it ends up. As I do caution people, I still think, because I hear it every way, Trump is done, and then I hear, Biden is done, and I would caution both sides, it's not done.
Nope.
I still will argue it is not done. There are all kinds of factors here, wild cards. This is the craziest time in American history, period. So, but the good news for Biden is that, he is ahead in the polls.
Yep, and he's raising
Right.
money, and Obama's going to do his first virtual fundraising event, so that should bring in a couple more bucks.
Right, exactly. With him, on board and out there, raising money. Of course, they can. Especially, past presidents, if they want to, can really get in there and do some money raising.
It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But Bob, I appreciate the time as always. Good stuff.
Thank you, Rick.
Our good friend Bob Ney. Let's take a quick break. Right back to wrap things up. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show.
Saving work in America, one show at a time. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1908. That was the day that the Executive Board of the American Federation of Labor established its Metal Trades Department. The goal was to coordinate the organizing and legislative efforts of those in the many metal trades. The department joined together workers from sheet metal workers to blacksmiths, iron shipbuilders to brass and silver workers, foundry workers to stove mounters, and more. In all, 600,000 workers were members. The new department held its first convention in Cincinnati, Ohio, that following February. One of the earliest major work projects involving the new department was the construction of the Panama Canal. More than 70,000 workers, including many metal workers, worked on the canal over a decade. By the time the canal was completed in 1914, more than 5,000 workers had died on the project. The metals department often had to navigate an ever-changing demand for the skills of its members. In times of war, as orders for battleships soared, the workers were in high demand. During peacetime, orders fell. In 1945, the U.S. Navy recognized the contribution of metal workers during World War II. They christened the USS Joseph S. McDonough. The ship was named after a former Secretary-Treasurer of the Metal Trades Department who had worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. One of the key victories of the Metal Department was the passage of the 1938 Federal Apprenticeship and Training Act. The year prior, Metal Department President John Fry was appointed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the labor representative for the first Apprenticeship Committee. The act formalized apprenticeship training programs. Today, the Metals Department of the AFL-CIO represents thousands of workers in 17 unions. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
Time to lock up some CEOs and some corporate executives. A new report out by the Associated Press points out that for decades, this company, Bradkin Incorporated, they are a Kansas City-based metal company. They are a supplier of high-strength steel made specifically for our submarines. Evidently, it is being... federal prosecutors in court papers today pointed out that they believe that the company has been shortchanging them on subpar metals, basically selling them crap, and falsifying the lab tests and all of the things that the government looks to go, okay, this is acceptable. They've been cheating, the U.S. government out of money. They claim that this has been going on for decades. And it's one of these things where it's not about fining them. For me, there should be people who go, every person who is part of this should go to jail. Every supervisor who signed off on it. Every person who didn't step forward. And this is the kind of stuff that you just go, again, as a union person, you go, have job protections that protect you when this stuff comes up. I mean, it's infuriating to think, what if we were in a conflict where you needed those and you've got these crappy built submarines? This idea that everything for a buck, this corporate mentality of which we have been so bought and sold into. And these people never seem to be held accountable. And, I think about, some of the stories that we've heard coming out, just some of the horrible tragedies from the Black Lives Matter folks. I think about the guy in Philadelphia, stole 3 peppermint patties and sat in jail for over 500 days, waiting for a place to go to jail. Over 3 freaking peppermint patties. And yet these people who cheat us out of millions and billions of dollars and cheat every which way possible end up getting a slap on the wrist and a small fine. It's really crazy to me. It's crazy what corporate America gets away with. And again, they're masters at this stuff. They are masters at papering over the horrible stuff that they do. It's crazy. Also, the news coming out today, evidently there are 42 Fortune 100 companies who have pledged $1.6 billion to work on inequality in the minority communities. The big one, oddly enough, Bank of America, $1 billion. And it's one of those things where you go, aren't they the ones who, aren't they the ones screwing poor people the most? Isn't it odd that they're going to send $1 billion to try and tap all this down because we want people to get back to normal so we can keep cheating them? Evidently, Walmart has pledged $100 million. Comcast $100 million, Apple $100 million, Anthem $50 million, Nike $40, Alphabet, which is Google and their cluster, $38 billion, and there are 35 other companies that have pledged a total of $202 million to get you to $1.63 billion. And you go, not a bad start. I'm sure that we can rebuild some of the areas that have been torched. We can rebuild some of the places that need it. Maybe we can build a couple of houses in that. But that doesn't seem to me to be quite enough. It's a nice bit of charity. It's a good thing for the PR department to be able to post on a release. But ultimately, when you hear the stories from people who have been cheated repeatedly by these big corporations, I don't know that I'm buying it. I really don't know that I'm buying it. Now, hey, look, is it helpful? Sure. Maybe we can rebuild some stuff. Maybe people can get some education and we can get some health care. But ultimately, this is going to be something our government's going to have to deal with. I don't see it going away anytime soon. And as I've been saying for a long time, it's about the economics of it. It's about how do we ensure that everyone has equal opportunity, and not just equal opportunity, but the opportunity to move forward for everybody. See, for me, that's the point in this. For everybody. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. If you missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com is where you get the podcast, the Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go. Lots to get to this week. Lots to talk about on our week back. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts and what you are thinking. rick@thericksmithshow.com is how you get a hold of me. I appreciate the time. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you back here next time.
You've been listening to The Rick Smith Show. Email Rick at rick@thericksmithshow.com.